right, so welcome to the inaugural IHR Theory and Methods Roundtable, or as we'll soon discover, it might be beyond method towards style. We'll see, but we'll get there in a moment. I want to do two things to get us started. One, I'll introduce our speakers, and two, I'll sort of give you a sense of the direction the conversation is going to travel. So on the first note, Julian Lim is Associate Professor and Faculty Head of History in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Professor Lim is a scholar of history and law whose multiple award-winning first book, Porous Borders, Multiracial Migrations in the Law in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, received the David J. Weber Clements Center Prize for Best Book in the American Southwest, as well as the IHR Book Award, among other honors, achievements, and awards. Professor Lim's new work engages U.S. territorial control and border expansions from the 1880s to the 1910s in dialogue with critical legal histories about the historical development of plenary power doctrine. Brian Goodman is assistant professor in the Department of English and a faculty affiliate at the Leveton Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies and the Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Goodman's work engages with U.S. literature and human rights, dissident literatures, and Jewish studies, among other fields. His first book, entitled The Nonconformists, American and Czech Writers Across the Iron Curtain, will be published by Harvard University Press this June. He is contemplating a new project that would attempt to triangulate the politics of literary exchange between Eastern Europe, the United States, and Latin America. Lucas Klein is Associate Professor of Chinese in the School of International Letters and Cultures. His work as a writer and translator spans both pre-modern and modern Chinese literary production. Professor Klein's focus is on how work and labor, nature and environment, and translation and metasinology appear in the field of Chinese poetics, with critical implications for how we understand the mediating function of translated poetry as less an object to which something is done, but rather a subject form from which knowledge emerges through the process of translation. He is the executive editor of Shutong, Library of Classical Chinese Literature, published by Oxford University Press. Will Hedberg is Associate Professor of Japanese in the School of International Letters and Cultures and Associate Director of the Asia Center at ASU. Professor Hedberg's first book, The Japanese Discovery of Chinese Fiction, The Water Margin and the Making of a National Canon, dropped from Columbia University Press in 2019. The book looks at the Japanese reception of Chinese fiction to question how we rethink margins and centers, literature and politics, and the prospects and possibilities of trans-regional humanities scholarship. In his new book project, Professor Hedberg expands his critical purview to encompass a broader constellation of objects in media, including fiction, drama, maps, treatises on geography, and illustrations for considering how Japanese relations became radically reconfigured through contact with Northeast, Central, and Southeast Asia. Finally, Kevin McHugh is Associate Professor in the School of Geography and Sciences and Urban Planning. His primary interests are in geophilosophy and sensory geographies. Professor McHugh is exploring a series of critical aesthetic experiments in more than human and elemental geographies. Drawing on proximal thermal sensing, he is creating thermal imaginaries with the aim of developing a post-phenomenology and elemental ethics worthy of the Earth itself. Kevin is working on a book manuscript for the University of Minnesota Press, Elemental Geographies, Sensing the Arts of the Anthropocene. And his current project, Parable of the Parasite, is a fabulation in parasitic relations, critiquing the human as parasite par excellence, opening up a far-reaching ethics in interspecies relations. Now, earlier this week, we discussed what a roundtable on theory and method might accomplish that best serves the IHR community. And our conversation rapidly centered on possibilities, specifically those which lie beyond strict definitions of either theory or method, since wide-ranging horizons and prospects now define how humanities practices increasingly operate, in direct contrast to previous periods in the academy that involve things as severe as the so-called method wars, during which one's allegiance to a method or a school of thought sharply defined one's purview, friends, foes, allies, enemies, you name it. So very much in a spirit of openness, difference, exchange, and possibility, the guiding idea for our informal conversation today, in some ways, is an experiment in what happens when one replaces method with style or some other designator. In short, this precipitates the originating question that I'll pose to the group. How does one's orientation and aspirations within and for the arts and humanities inflect how one chooses what one does, the way one approaches it, and the outcomes one wishes to have? Who's up first?
Do we need to use a microphone? Or?
Yeah.
Is it on? Okay. So I don't know if this is going to answer that big question, but I think in thinking about this roundtable, I was trying to remember how I came to this point in my career. And, this question comes a lot actually from grad students about how I came along this path. And to be completely honest, my path into academia and into history was not the most planned or linear. Even I majored as an English literature major in college. I went to college not liking history because of the way it had been taught in high school. I took one history class, which I enjoyed in college, but really my passion at that time was in literature. I just really enjoyed language and words and imagining other kinds of sort of kind of these creative worlds that were being created in the books and poetry and novels that I had been reading. So I thought that I was actually going to go into maybe comp lit or into a literature program afterwards, but I actually didn't know what that meant or what I would do with it. And my parents, came to the US as poor, uneducated, working class immigrants. And so the path at that point for me had been medicine or law. And because of my sort of affinity towards language and making arguments and writing and reading, very text heavy kinds of work, the law made more sense for me. I love law school, but I did not enjoy practicing law. Pretty quickly I realized that, but I actually really enjoyed law school and the kind of way it reworked my brain in lots of ways. And but for me, the most important thing about law school was that fortunately, that's when I realized that history mattered. And I had the benefit of two professors who mentored me. And it's one of them that said, have you ever thought about becoming a professor? You're really good at writing, you're really good at reading, you're really good at paying attention to language and text, and this could be a good career for you. And until that point, that had never been on a possibility, like not even an idea in my mind. And so I say all this to explain how I think the arts and humanities has shaped how I got here, but it has been a very coincidental path, not planned at all. But I think what it does, the way I got into history reflects that real interest that I've always had in language and text, and in sort of imagining different kinds of pasts and potentially futures.
And I really like how you began with a story of kind of how you got here, because I feel that's often something that we don't talk about enough in terms of kind of explaining our intellectual genealogies to our students, to our graduate students, to our peers. And I think that's really important. And in terms of thinking of method, in our kind of preliminary discussion 2 nights ago, what I like so much about when Kevin proposed sort of thinking of style in terms of method is I think that in some ways style and kind of emphasizes that, I don't know, individual or aesthetic or kind of contingent, that coincidental. I really like that term coincidental because I think that's what I do, right? I mean, like, every project that I felt passionate about, every project that I've, feel like I've contributed something maybe in my own scholarship has really been kind of a result of encountering two texts or two ideas or meeting two different people, in a very chance way. And method, again, in some ways, I feel like that obscures that process of just kind of, that very individual development. And again, I really like that idea of coincidence or chance or contingency. When I talk to my students about teaching, I often feel like my job is to throw as many works of art or literature into my students' path in the hopes that one of them, for whatever reason on that particular morning, will, kind of interact with them in a very sublime way. So that idea of contingency, chance, is not something I thought about much in terms of research or teaching when I was a graduate student, but it's really become central to how I think about what I do now. So that's a really wonderful way to start us off. Thank you.
Lots to respond to. So I'm excited for the discussion. I guess we're already in it, but the one thing I wanted to say, like the only thing I'd sort of prepared or thought about in on the drive over here to talk about was something I've been thinking a lot about after just finishing a first project is sort of how there's been a kind of strange reversal. In the first case, there were sort of like these objects or these things that I was really fascinated by that I wanted to understand better. I told an anecdote on Tuesday about that, which I can say more about later, about getting a secret police document, referring to the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, and not knowing what to do with it, right? But like an object of fascination. And then, so I had the beginning of a literary history, but I needed to I went in search of a method or a theory that could help me understand that object, or that history. After finishing that first project, now I feel like it's almost like I have this theory sort of that maybe as a byproduct of the first project. Now I'm in search, again, of a method to understand that theory and a literary history of where that theory comes from. And so I think this idea of style is really interesting, potentially as a solution, because I've been kind of banging my head against the wall. The next thing I write, I don't know whether I wanted to send it to a journal of literature, a journal of history, to come back to the kind of identity crisis between history and literature that you mentioned. And style is interesting as a possible solution. I was thinking about what do we mean by style in this context? And for me, it seemed like a really useful way of triangulating between object, method or theory, and on the other hand, audience, right? So it's sort of like style talks about the relationship, not just between a personal methodological relationship with object, but also, there's an implied reception by somebody. Style's trying to communicate something to somebody, either aesthetically or intellectually. So I think it's a really generative idea that we came up with on the fly. And I'm excited to hear what everybody else has to say about it as we move forward in the conversation.
I'm thinking about being on this panel with the members of the literati. I thought, what am I going to do? I said, well, I'm a geographer. If you trace geography to its Greek roots, it means earth writing. So I write the earth. And I write the earth in coordination with an object. Here's my object. We talk about thinking with things and through things. This is a FLIR Systems i5 infrared camera. So I say I write the earth, but in reality, the i5 camera writes the earth. And I am the mobility to take the camera where it wants to go to sense heat. That means across the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and as I say, cosmic elsewheres. And anywhere I go, actually, I take the camera with me. And I generate thermograms, infrared images. And I'm doing a series of experiments. My credo, my style, can be summed up as in experience and experiment. I'm interested in creative experiential geographies and how they affect people. Yes, facts are important, but we must go beyond facts in geography. We must talk about experiential geography. So I create thermal imaginaries that hopefully have some impact with audiences. When I talk about the earth and elemental forces of the earth like heat, and how can we, as inhabitants of this planet, attune to these elemental forces? One way is through aesthetics. So I bring geoaesthetics, thermal sensing, into conversation with a series of philosophical thinkers. The fleshy phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, the elemental philosophy of Levinas, the becoming molecular of Deleuze, and the agential realism of Barad. So the geoaesthetics and the philosophers converse together and create these imaginaries. And here's an example of it. And in this particular experiment, my style was to become imperceptible in heat, to solve the egocentric subject in the face of the elemental force of heat, and to create a new subject, a subject more attuned to the planet, in the hopes of developing ultimately a geophilosophy and an elemental ethics in which we live more hospitably and with more compassion and care with other humans and our non-human neighbors. So that's the bigger picture. Creative experiential geographies, thinking through geoaesthetics, and a series of philosophical interlocutors.
Wow. I didn't want to go first. I also didn't want to go last. Too late for that. I have two things that I want to say. The first is about sort of my approach. You could say it's my style. I think methodology is probably too broad or narrow or something for me to really sort of claim at that moment. The second thing that I want to say has to do with how I think we should handle ourselves within academia. So translation. I translate. I primarily translate poetry from Chinese, sometimes classical Chinese poetry into English, sometimes modern Chinese poetry into English. And I not only translate and do translations, I also study translations. And I think that translation is really a fundamental way that we do encounter and also should understand ourselves as encountering, well, almost anything, but particularly literature. There is a whole lot of disparagement of translation in, well, you know, in life, also especially in academic life, in intellectual kind of life, particularly in the English language. We have this expression about things being lost in translation, even though, you know, the real loss of translation is when no translation is happening at all. You know, translators, we don't, generally speaking, get our names on the covers of our books, right? Other mediators, other actors, you know, Hollywood actors will get their names above the title. Translators are lucky even to be mentioned in book reviews. And you know, in our division, right? My division, Will's division of Silk, the School of International Letters and Cultures, one of the ways that I've heard us try to justify ourselves within the academy or within ASU here or within the colleges, you know, we believe that there's a real importance of looking at the material in its own language, right? In the original language, not in translation. And yes, I believe in that too, right? I mean, I study Chinese, I speak Chinese. There are a handful of other languages that I know to varying degrees. And so obviously there's some sort of importance of dealing with that primary language, primary text in its source language. But also, it doesn't really matter. At any point, we're always mediating, we're always translating, and everything that we're getting is always going to be filtered or translated or something through various different lenses. Various different kinds of experiences and subjectivities at the same time. And so if we continue to disparage translation and prioritize some notion of, you know, a sort of, you know, primary experience, which actually never really happens, then we end up denying a whole lot of other things that do happen and that also are very important. So for instance, if we want to look at something like Chinese poetry, how it's come to mean, what it has come to mean, not only in Chinese, but around the world, in various different ways, those are mediations that have happened through acts of translation. And we can read those. We can read those closely. We can read those with detail. We can contextualize them. And we can do all the things that we do in historical or literary analysis that we often forget to do with acts of translation because we're so sort of busy saying, oh, well, here's a mistake, or that's not very good, or whatever. Sometimes mistakes can be very productive. Sometimes they're just mistakes and they should be corrected. But some kinds of mistakes or whatever, they're not necessarily a bad thing that we should be ashamed of, but they're also part of the methodology or part of the heuristic or part of the style. And so that's, I guess, my opening sort of appeal that I want to make about taking translation, you know, in particular literary translation and poetic translation, but not limited to such, very seriously. The second thing that I want to say is has to do with how I think we should handle ourselves in academia. And I came across a quotation somebody referred, it was the journalist Lloyd Rose referred to Bugs Bunny as a gentleman anarchist. And then in a follow-up piece he wrote, Bugs must always be a winner, but a winner in contests he clearly views as idiotic. And so I think that's the attitude that I want to encourage us all to share when it comes to academia as a contest. I want us to win. I also want us to view this contest as clearly idiotic. Thanks.
So yeah, we said this would be an informal conversation where we ask questions of one another. So yeah, take it away.
Can I ask everybody a question? I love this idea of contingency. So I was wondering, maybe this is like kind of putting everybody on the spot, but if everybody on the panel could give an example of contingency having almost a determinative effect on sort of a methodological or theoretical turn in your own work. You know, here I've been thinking a lot about, like, you know, the further I get away from grad school, the like sort of coincidental contingent nature of when a work of scholarship is published or translated, and then you have a cohort of graduate students who kind of internalize that methodology. I'm even saying even a more kind of on a smaller scale, even than like say a turn. Like, it seems like the transnational turn seems important for a lot of people at this table. But you know, I'm almost specific works of scholarship, or an encounter, or two texts side by side, or you know, I just think it's a really generative way of kind of lifting the curtain about where we arrive at, or how and where we arrive at our methodologies and theories.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm looking forward to hearing how everybody weighs in on that. In my case, I was talking with Julian about this before the panel started. Like Lucas, I come from an East Asian studies background, very much the area studies model, which is sort of notorious, if somewhat simplistically, being accused of being without method. I don't think that's true, but what I do think is true is it's a field where the nation state is very much alive and well. You know, for all the encouragement for kind of transnational topic, interdisciplinarity, you know, by and large, traditionally it's changing in East Asian studies. You pick a lane, you're a modernist, you're a pre-modernist. China, Japan, Korea, you know, nation state, language, periodization really have a very powerful centripetal effect in kind of replicating the field. I studied Chinese as an undergraduate. I went to graduate school intending to write a dissertation about a particular late imperial Chinese novel. I was very much, Chinese studies was my focus. As a result of being focusing on Chinese, everyone is required to take 3 years of Japanese, kind of, you know, introductory college level Japanese, in the hopes that you can read Japanese language articles about Chinese literature down your career. I loved my class. You know, it's sort of seen as kind of rite of passage that in many cases you endure, you know, either, you know, the second language requirement. I loved it so much so that I, you know, decided 2 years into my graduate program to tackle another category 5 language, which tacked on, you know, I did everything you're really not supposed to do, you know, switch languages, switch fields, you know, add on multiple years to my graduate school clock. But it was transformative, and I realized that's where my passion was. And there's so many connections. This novel that I was interested in made it to Japan. It was a blockbuster hit. It impacted ideas about translation, language, national identity. There was so much there that had not been talked about a great deal because, you know, the traditional institutional configuration was to study Chinese or Japanese. Yes, there's a little dialogue between fields, but it was just this very eye-opening moment to realize that by kind of doing what I wanted to do, even if it sort of raised some eyebrows, it just opened up, you know, just a world that in 10 lifetimes I'll never finish exhausting. So my second project is still kind of a ripple from that very bold decision to kind of not jump ships, but occupy 2 ships halfway through my graduate career. So that's my contingency.
Yeah, this is great. And I think of another word, circumstance. Circumstance is like contingency. It's the circumstances we're in, what we're surrounded by, that really shape what we do. And I was thinking about events and encounters. My path in geography has been so weird. I started out doing migration modeling, statistics and stuff. So I totally shifted into social cultural geography and stuff. But I think what really has affected me is the geoaesthetics of it. The discovery of art, discovery of aesthetics in geography. That was a beautiful moment when I realized how aesthetic geography is. One of the best 2 hours I ever spent in my life was with this instrument in the Shindani Sculpture Garden in northern New Mexico. That place blew my mind. In infrared, it is so trippy. I left that place with, 500 images, and I'm still grappling with what they're trying to tell me. Amazing. Another encounter I had like this was at the VLA. I have been thinking about the idea of distancing in geography for a long time. I really like this idea of modulation and distancing because I'm a phenomenologist, moving closer to, backing away. Distance is optical, but also haptic. The VLA blew my mind because the far away was nearby. So really, the far away nearby. So that really, the Very Large Array, the National Radio Observatory in the plains of in central western Mexico. Anyway, so it's these encounters. I think geographers call this the taking place of events and encounters, but it's the geoaesthetics of it, I think, those circumstances that move me.
Thanks. I guess I have two sort of happenstance kind of encounters that I think of that shape the sort of mental path that I've gone on since. One, I guess I was a freshman in high school, and I was chatting with this girl who was a year older, and she was taking some world religions class, and I happened to pick up a copy of the Dao De Jing in Stephen Mitchell's translation that she had on the floor outside of her locker, and I was sort of looking through it, and I kind of found it compelling. And she was going on about how she hated it. She thought it was really obnoxious and pretentious, and so I read it, and I was really inspired by it. And I read everything else about Taoism that I could. I read the Tao of Pooh and all these other books, and then I sort of thought all these I was at 14 or so, hanging out in like New Age sections of bookstores, looking about all this stuff about ancient Chinese philosophy, and they all said the same thing, these books. They were like, well, if you really want, this is as far as we can go in introducing Taoism, because it always indicates that there's always a core suspicion of language. So any sort of book is only going to take you so far. Also, this is a book in English. And so if you really want to learn about Taoism, about ancient Chinese philosophy, then go and study classical Chinese. And so the next summer, or 2 summers afterwards, the summer I turned 16, I enrolled in a summer school class in Chinese at Northwestern University. And I took the L up from downtown Chicago, every day for 7 weeks of a summer school class. I grew up in Chicago, lived in the city. And that was my first year of Chinese. And I'd always gotten like a B+ in French in high school, like nothing too bad, but nothing too good. But I got 100% on my first Chinese test when I was 16, and I was taking class with all these college students. And so somehow it just clicked. And I had no sense of how far classical Chinese was from everyday modern, Mandarin. Like in the first Chinese class, so this is the early 90s, and we're still using this textbook for Chinese that had been written in the 70s. And so it was like the first lessons were like, please come in, please have a seat, please have a smoke, please drink some tea. Those were some of the first sentences in Chinese that I learned. No real sense of how far that was from reading, Laozi and Zhuangzi in Chinese, but it didn't really matter, because there I was on the path, so to speak. Another sort of contingency is at one point, so I met I took a class with someone at Middlebury College where I was an undergrad, and his name was Bob Buckeye. And he was not a professor. He was the archivist in the library. But every year he would teach a class on American modernist literature. And then I got to know him. And at some point, I guess in my senior year, he also ran a lecture series. And so he would bring people to Middlebury, Vermont to give these talks. And one person he invited was Elliot Weinberger, the translator and essayist. And I was just blown away. Weinberger read this. The talk that he gave was a reading of his essay called Karmic Traces. which really just blew me away. And I was, so impressed. I went to talk to him afterwards, and I said, "Oh, I was, I wanted to sort of impress. I was like, oh, I was reading this book of lectures that Borges had given, and he said this, and Weinberger said, oh yeah, I translated. It was a quotation from Borges' book 7 Nights, and Weinberger was like, oh, I translated that book. I was like, well, so much for impressing this guy. But that too was like a very formative kind of like, pay attention to the translator, pay attention to translation, and pay attention to the various kinds of happenstances and things that Weinberger calls karmic traces that sort of happen in various let's say reincarnations of literary and cultural activity as they sort of flow throughout the world. So those are mine.
I guess I have to answer too. The more I think about it, sort of contingency all the way down, or circumstance. So I mentioned, as an undergraduate, I'd gone to Prague to basically I applied for research funding just to fund, the time I was going to hang out in Prague and travel around Central Europe, and ended up getting connected with this kind of ex-dissident, shady guy. That's a whole other story, as I would discover later. But he hands me Allen Ginsberg's secret police document. And it's sort of like, oh, I guess I have to do something with this. So I wrote an undergraduate thesis about it. The only person who would really sponsor the project or really got what I was trying to do happened to be in American Studies, which seems, paradoxical. You're doing something about Prague, but this is the transnational term, right? So I thought that was it. I thought the Czech experience was sort of behind me to a certain extent. And I was doing my master's, and I went to a lecture. I thought I was going to work on transatlantic modernism. And I went to a lecture being given by the great literary biographer, Hermione Lee. And she started talking about Philip Roth. And I said, oh, I love Philip Roth. I picked up a few of his books in Prague at a used bookstore. He's from where I was from. Made me feel less homesick. So I was like, I'm going to talk to her. Maybe I can do a project with her on Philip Roth. And I said, so I went to her office. She's terrifying. She's a very frightening person. And she said, well, what's your favorite Philip Roth novel? And I could tell that the whole relationship hung on my answer. I said, The Ghostwriter? She said, that's correct. So I worked with her on a thesis on Philip Roth. Again, I thought this would be sort of disjointed. I only later realized that Philip Roth had spent the 1970s traveling to Prague, had been also followed by the secret police. So ultimately, right, this all starts being stitched together into a larger project that became my first book. But there's the methodological piece that's kind of funny, which is by coincidence, not coincidence. I became enamored with biographical methods, right? Because Hermione Lee thinks a lot about life writing in really interesting ways. And its relationship to criticism and literary history. And she's really sophisticated in style, frankly. So that was sort of in the back of my head. And then you get to graduate school, and I was there is that moment when there's the book that, when I started graduate school, the book that was translated into English and sort of was, the year before I got there was Mark McGurl, The Program Era, for all the people who were studying American literature. And so, a raft of dissertations focused on, governmental organizations like the NEA or Hollywood unions, and the way that the way that these kinds of institutional contexts shape literature. So for my cohort, or for a group of us, it was sort of Pascal Castanova's World Republic of Letters. I didn't agree with everything in the book. I didn't take everything from it, but one particular point was stuck in my mind that connected with Hermione Lee, which was the idea of focusing on what she calls the foreign exchange brokers of the World Republic of Letters, translators, but also, all sorts of other literary people play a role in the literary universe. So those are the people I started looking for. If a novelist had been an editor or a translator, all the better to focus on them. I sort of followed that trail, and that led me in really interesting directions. And finally, when I applied to American Studies programs, and I just got lucky that a really fantastic scholar of Czech dissidents was at my university and pointed me to a theoretical text that had nothing to do with Slavic studies, came actually from the world of sort of queer studies, which was Michael Warner's Counterpublics. And so I started to play, really, this idea wasn't just the foreign exchange brokers, but the circulation of texts and how that creates these subcultural reading communities. And it started to kind of feel more full as a picture I could create and imagine. So started imagining sort of what would a counterpublic of letters look like if we were thinking about the United States and Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. So like all of this is accidental, right? I mean, this project could have turned out so differently. So I don't know. I feel like for any graduate students who are hearing this, it's very useful to know that you can't always predict in advance the methods or theories that are going to be useful to you. It almost has to start with an object of fascination or an embrace of contingency and circumstance and follow that where it leads. I don't know. That's not very helpful advice, I know, but maybe it is for some.
I'm going to echo just what you just said, because I think that's absolutely true. It's been the case for me. So there's two contingencies that I was going to describe, moments of contingency. One related to the first dissertation book, and then the second one related to the current project. The first one, so when I applied to grad school, I applied with the idea that I wanted to study sort of the histories and experiences of Asian Americans as well as Latinos in conversation, like together. I grew up in California in the Bay Area. My family's very mixed. It was sort of my reality, but I realized once you got to college that all these studies get very siloed, right? African American studies, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, Native American studies. And my idea was I wanted to actually see how they were in conversation with each other. I did not want to talk about immigration though, because that seemed to be in law school the only places we saw Asian Americans or Latinos was like in the immigration class or in the immigration context. So my goal was to not work on immigration. It was to work on mixed relations and how it might have shaped like residential or property rights, racial restrictive covenants, those types of issues. But in my first year of grad school, I happened to read Erica Lee's first book. She's a historian of Chinese immigration. And in her book, El Paso is a very important place for the migration of Chinese immigrants during the exclusion era. The second book that I closely read in terms of chronology at the time was a book by Mario T. Garcia called Desert Immigrants, which is all about El Paso. And I realized El Paso might be a very important meeting place for these different groups that might give me a vantage point to understand this history. So I originally planned on going to Texas and to El Paso to look at multiracial relations. The archives were not very generous in giving me this kind of the stories that I was looking for. But what became more and more apparent was just how important immigration and the border was actually in shaping some of the relations that I was able to find evidence for. And so that's how my first book became, and that's how I became a scholar of race, migration, and borders. The second project that I'm working on right now is again about kind of the expansion of US borders, the expansion of federal immigration law, looking at diverse migrations, and tracing how that happens over a series of decades from the 1870s into the early 1900s. But in doing this history, I'm starting to realize how important it is to understand the development of federal immigration law as happening kind of in conversation with the development of federal Indian law and territorial law in the West during the late 19th century. I don't think I would have seen those connections without being here at ASU, without being in Arizona, realizing how important Native and Indigenous history is to US, to the history of this region, but also the continent, the world. So I think that's like, I feel very fortunate to have been hired at ASU, to have come here, to have been here and to make these connections, because I think it's really helping me to understand the kinds of, to be able to answer the kinds of questions that I have about immigration law. But this actually kind of, I can open it up since everyone has had a chance to another question that builds on William's statements earlier about how you were saying how sort of Japanese literature and Chinese literature get siloed into these nation-bound kind of categories, and how sometimes students might pursue studies that follow sort of already sketched out or kind of planned itineraries, but you did something different, right? And I'm wondering if breaking some of those channels and crossing into new directions, do you ever feel like it made you illegible when you went on the market, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes. Yes, it did. I'd be very interested. It sounds like all of us, had sort of parallel trajectories in terms of, becoming deliriously excited about an artifact or something that we weren't supposed to study. So yes, it did. I mean, to be totally frank, I spent several unsuccessful years on the job market. I was given 150% encouragement by all my advisors to kind of follow my own wishes and trajectory, but there's always a caveat. It's going to be difficult, to find a job. So you really do want to present yourself as one or the other. And I just didn't feel like I was. I still don't feel like I'm one or the other. I don't know what I am. And I also feel very lucky. ASU, we've got an interesting group of people in our school and across university more broadly, where it's true that I feel like if you're passionate about a project, that kind of traditional delineation of field doesn't matter as much. So I that's another story, but I feel very lucky that I was interviewed by the group of people I was and have the colleagues that I do. But to me, this is essential. I'm going to be talking about this as a faculty mentor at the Association of Asian Studies Conference. How do you do trans-regional research in an environment that rhetorically and vocally really welcomes them, right? Nobody would say they're not trans-regional or interdisciplinary, but when it comes down to the field itself, these gates are still very much in place. And I don't know what I'm thinking about this right now. I don't know what my answer to these graduate students I'm going to be meeting here soon is. It's some mixture of make sure you're legible and also follow your heart. And I don't know how those things resolve themselves. I think kind of pure. Yeah, I'd be really eager to hear how other people answer that question. Right.
I want to start with maybe a more general thing I observed in graduate school. It's so hard to, it's kind of a fool's errand to try to tailor one's project to the job market, given how disastrous it is. So that's like the first observation I'd make. But one thing I did notice when I was in graduate school, I did my PhD in an interdisciplinary program that was like radically open in terms of what the kinds of projects people did. But the one thing I liked about how it was structured is like during the oral exam stage, you had to choose like a major field, right? And then, everything else was kind of all over the map. And I went back and forth. Is my major field going to be history or literature, 20th century U.S. literature, 20th century U.S. history? And I ended up sort of doing both, and then something kind of strange for the third field. But I only bring that up because it sort of was, I do think that it's wise and strategic to kind of feel when you're in early stages of a career to give yourself grounding in a discipline that becomes very helpful, not just on the job market, but if you end up teaching. I teach the U.S. Literature Survey in our department every semester. I love it. I can't imagine, feeling so comfortable doing it if I hadn't made that choice. But otherwise it's completely contingent and random to come back to those terms. I mean, I don't think if ASU wasn't hiring someone doing U.S. literature, Jewish studies in a certain kind of transnational or comparative way, and the specific people on the search committee didn't find sort of the context of the Eastern Bloc legible as a place where that could produce writers that an Americanist or someone in Jewish studies would be interested in, I wouldn't have found this job, and I can't imagine what other job I would have found. The only thing I will say in terms of outside the job market, the way I approached this once I had a project and was sort of embarking on the dissertation is I felt illegible all the time and felt like I didn't really belong anywhere. So I started paying real close attention, like at conferences or informal meetings with other graduate students, whose eyes would glaze over when I talked to them and whose eyes would light up. And yeah, and I discovered that, you know, it wasn't who you'd expect. So it was, in my case, for instance, I went to a conference and it was folks who were focused on the intersections of literature and human rights. Were really interested in my project because some of the people I think about are foundational thinkers in human rights movement of the 1970s. And so I said, and I started engaging with their work, seeing what it brought to my work. My postdoc ended up being at a human rights center. And I never would have predicted that coming in. And same with arriving in Jewish studies. You know, I didn't necessarily understand when I embarked on the project exactly what my project offered to Jewish studies and what Jewish studies would change about the way I think about what I'm doing. But now it's integral to kind of some of the projects I'm working on right now and the last book. So yeah, there is a kind of reciprocity that you have to keep your eye out for, I think, in order to overcome that inevitable feeling of illegibility that many of us, it sounds like, share.
Yeah, I think maybe just say a few remarks about beginning of career, middle career. I think one thing that would be good to say for people who are watching this is that not to think small and not to worry about rendering themselves illegible if that's where they want to go. I mean, I've shifted. I think I call it like a drift, drifting from positivist science into sort of humanist stuff, now post-humanist. And a big moment for me was discovering critical theory and steeping myself and re-educating myself. I didn't study that in graduate school at all. It's all in the last 15, 18 years. And it's like, I'm a new person. Like, and everyone said, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And I do see colleagues that have been publishing in the same arena for 40 years, and they're really well known. They have big H factors and a lot of citations. But I don't think they seem too excited about their work all the time. I'm always looking for something different to do and move on. And I think I think sometimes you have to take these leaps. And they say, well, I like your images in your papers, but what's all the philosophy about? Like, well, they match up. Read it again carefully, right? So I think that through time, things move and drift and shift, and circumstances change, and you have to move with those.
I really like that word illegible, Julian. So my dissertation is half about 20th century Chinese poetry and half about medieval Chinese Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry. And when it came to, and of course my advisor said, oh, well, maybe this is too broad. Maybe you should focus. Maybe you should pick one. And I wasn't going to do that. But then when it came to revising the dissertation and turning it into a book, and you know, approaching different presses, I thought, well, this is going to be a crossover hit. You know, everyone's going to love my book. I got turned down by, I think, 10 different acquisitions editors. With various stages of, you know, sending it out for external review or not, and just simply because the discourses of studying 20th and 21st century Chinese literature and anything pre-modern. There are two periods in Chinese literature. There's modern, which starts in 1919, and there's traditional. I mean, it's a bullshit term, but that's what we call it. Well, that's what everybody else calls it. I don't. And so, but the discourses are just so different that a lot of people had a lot of trouble making sense of or being able to read what I was trying to do. And of course, they all, you know, expressed that in ways of going after aspects of my scholarship, which I'm sure, you know, certain things needed to be fixed here and there, of course. But it was really clear that, okay, these silos, so it's not only nation state, right? It's not only language. It's also just a certain way of looking at it, a certain way of thinking about it. And by the way, that's why I was interested in doing two periods together. I really loved the Tang Dynasty poetry that I had been reading. I was just really bored with the discourse about it. I was much more interested in the discourse about modern, about 20th century poetry and poetics. But you know, with the exception of those poets that I was looking at, I wasn't as enamored with the poetry itself. And so I wanted to find the the best of both worlds at risk of, you know, being stuck in the worst of both worlds. And that's something that happens in translation too, right? I mean, one of the reasons I got interested in translation was that I was, you know, going back and forth between literature classes where often, you know, in these classes, as you know, the professor has this wonderful way of just sucking everything that's interesting out of the literature and then saying, okay, what the author's trying to say is, and it's just really boring. Meanwhile, you've got your creative writing classes or whatever, where it's all very interesting and where it's all very not interesting, but it's like effective and touchy feely and let's talk. But where there just isn't that kind of rigor. And so I wanted to find a way, and I did in translation of having both the kind of dry analysis and also non-rigorous touchy. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Yeah, basically trying to find a way to have both that kind of scholarly rigor and also an emotional connection to the text that you're dealing with all at once. And so that kind of illegibility has I suppose been a driving force in my work, and it sounds like it's, you know, I'm not the only one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember going on when I was finishing up and going on the market, and you're sort of desperate and you apply for as many things as possible, but there were certain categories or certain areas of or fields that I did apply to pretty regularly. One was immigration, one was borderlands, Asian American, and I would have friends who could give me feedback afterwards when I it the rejection about like why that might have been. And if it was a borderlands position, it's because it seemed too immigration work. It wasn't really borderlands. Or if it was an immigration position, it seemed more borderlands, not at, you know, it was like this weird thing where I was in between all these different fields and people weren't quite sure. And so this is another, you know, moment of contingency is like, I happened, you know, ASU happened to be in a position to hire someone who works on borderlands and immigration, and it kind of worked out. And so something that Lucas said reminded me how very early on when I was trying to figure out what to write my dissertation on, I was taking a seminar with historian Mary Beth Norton, and I was talking to her about sort of grad school and things, and sort of whether I needed to be really pragmatic about my dissertation topic so that I would have success on the market. And, you know, this piece of advice has always stuck with me, which is that writing, and especially getting through a PhD program, is hard enough when you love your topic, right? So you just, so you can't, like, you shouldn't think of it that way. And so it's always been, I've been fortunate to feel like I've been able to follow just any weird or whatever kind of question that came to me, and it's worked out. But I also, you know, I recognize that we're in a very you know, we're in that Bugs Bunny world, right? We're the lucky ones in the Bugs Bunny world where we have been able to get these positions, and there's lots of other folks who might be trying to do the same thing but haven't. So I'm not quite sure. I don't know what kind of advice I would give your students either, but I think it's that intellectually, we should be able to say, follow whatever you want to follow, right?
Just a quick tag on that too, though. The only thing I would add to is the only way that I feel like I'm wiser than I was 10 years ago is I know now how difficult it is to write a book. Mm-hmm. Like I have a book that I did not have 10 years ago, and it's not just I mean, it's this physically somatic exhaustion, and the idea of trying to do that about a topic that I was not 180% passionate. I don't know how physically I could write a book about a topic that I was not just. So I don't know what advice I'm going to give in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned. But at the end of the day, it almost seems like it's impossible to take route A. I mean, unless you have that kind of just almost insane passion for that topic. I don't know how you write a book. It must be possible, but I can't physically. I can't do it.
So we have time perhaps for one final question, provocation for the group among themselves, or perhaps from our audience.
Okay, so just maybe a lightning round thing, or maybe something in terms of under the understanding of methodology. Because this is the Institute for Humanities Research, and it's about applying for grants, and sometimes grants will say, what is your methodology, right? And so it can be a really intimidating question, right? Because like, well, I'm a humanist, I ask some questions. And so how do you reply to those kinds of queries?
Well, as a historian, I'm going to emphasize archives, archives, archives. The archives I need to go to, the archives and what they hold. So that's one, I guess, sort of obvious way for historians. But for the kind of work that I do, I also talk about some of the other kind of different approaches that shape how I think about my historical subjects. And so thinking about immigration as not nation bound, but as following migrants in their transnational kind of circuits, and providing some idea of those other frameworks, the conceptual frameworks that shape how I approach and translate and interpret the things that I do find in the archives is what I try to provide in those kinds of grant applications.
My answer is very short because I've yet to get I've gotten an IHR book subvention grant, which was incredibly useful for getting the book over the finish line. But then it was sort of, I was describing something I'd done right in the application more than necessarily trying to project forward. So I don't know the answer. I mean, part of what I've tried to do in the past in my applications is do a little bit of maybe something. I emphasize archives. I emphasize the objects. Which actually I think says a lot about methodology already when you're describing what your objects are, because it implies a certain kind of methodology that then you can kind of describe. But usually I think it's maybe I assume for many of us, like describing those unsurprising juxtapositions of fields and the novelty of those moves.
Well, my methodology focuses around sensing. So you might call it devices for doing atmospheric things, using devices to sense, then bring those sensing products, as I said, into conversation with a group of thinkers. And so you have this conversation going back and forth between the sensing experiments and then the thinking, or how about the elemental earth, for example. And that's a little bit tricky to have the conversation work out. And not fall apart into two different directions. Like, oh, just tell me about your figures. I don't want images. I don't want to hear about the philosophy. You have to really wed them together as a singular methodology, as a singular method. And I love the challenge of that. It's really fun to take difficult philosophical texts and realize, my God, this is mind-bending, then demonstrate it through a sensing experiment. That is really rich. And then convincing others of it.
There's a book that's pretty important for a certain subset of scholars of East Asia called Asia as Method. I've read this book. I have no idea what its argument is, but it's a very it has been a very generative kind of title, at least. So you've got a lot of various East Asianists who will have papers, conferences called thus and such as method. There was even some sort of I guess a special issue of a journal not too long ago called Method as Method. So we're at the point of whatever the hell you want. So I will just, put in something like translation as method, and then maybe riff on that for a little bit. And I actually, that has the nice benefit of it beneath the verbiage. It's actually something I believe in. So which is helpful. But beyond that, I can then say, well, I want to look at, I want to blur the lines between original poetry and translation. I want to put poetic creation, translation in broader intellectual, in broader contexts of intellectual history and cultural history, literary history, and also have sort of a shifting gaze at looking at the various kinds of texts that I'm reading. And I think that who knows if the people at the other end of that grant application or whatever are going to find that compelling, or if their eyes are going to glaze over. But maybe they'll do that in a way they're like, okay, fine, we'll just click the higher numbers on that form with their glazed over eyes, and then maybe I win. We'll be a victor in this contest that we find ultimately ridiculous.
This might be kind of simplistic, but when I'm thinking about when I write grants, I often sort of see the section on method as just an invitation to demonstrate that you have a cohort. Having now also been on the other side, having reviewed grant applications, having reviewed, job letters, things like this, I think more than, seeing somebody say they're a post-Foucauldian, or just demonstrating somehow that there are people out there who are interested in these questions that you are partaking of and contributing to a larger dialogue surrounding this topic. To me, that's kind of what I see method as. I mean, the demonstration that, again, you are part of a conversation. You have your own unique style, and this is where I like the idea of style. I mean, you're going to approach that with your own kind of subjective, aesthetic, contingent experiences in mind, but that ability, again, just sort of demonstrate that you are part of this larger conversation on a very practical level. That's how I always kind of take a rough draft stab at the section on method.
Well, these were such brilliant and I think very affirming points for us to end on today. So let's thank our panelists so much for being here this morning. Thank you. And yeah, this will be a conversation that we'll be continuing with Carrie Wolf, who will be giving a talk on post-humanism in the wild in a couple of weeks. That'll be crossing the sort of critical and creative methodological side of things. And then in April, we'll be having Rebecca Solnit to the IHR. It'll be fabulous. We'll be thinking along a similar sort of axis in relation to the public and the public humanities. So we hope you all will join for these things, and thank you all so much again. Thanks.